Hello, and welcome to this session with our event sponsor, Sonatype, a very interesting business. And indeed, before we start, I'd just like to say that our speaker, Phyto Michael from Sonatype, who's solution architect for the MEA region, will be available to chat to you about any technical issues you want to raise with him. After we finish this session and after we've done a little Q&A, and you can meet Phyto and his colleagues at Sonatype by visiting them in their virtual exhibition area. You do that simply by clicking Virtual Exhibition Hall in the button to the right of your screen. When you get in there, you'll see a blue button at the Sonatype stand that enables you to start a chat with Phyto or one of his colleagues. So Phyto's topic is going to be very broadly on open source technologies, which we know is a very, very important topic. It has been for some years, but increasingly the risk management of open source is seen as a challenge by many banks as they move towards the strategic adoption of open source technologies to build their CI/CD pipeline. But I'll let Phyto explain more about the background to his role, to what Sonatype does, and indeed his presentation. Phyto, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Okay, so what we're really going to talk about, I'll just share my screen, is how we look at sort of enterprise adoption of open source and how that can be sort of utilized in the financial services industry. So myself, I've spent 10 years really in the software composition analysis space, working with organizations, helping them manage and remediate the risks associated with open source and the supply chain, which sort of has grown from that. One thing that's become clear for me is we're more reliant on ever than the supply chain, and faster is better. So tooling really is the only way to drive that. Sonatype obviously has tools in place to help you manage the full SDLC process and pipeline, and really understand what policies and processes are in place, and what components are good, bad, and really how they add value to your business. So from an overall nutshell, we look at the supply chain itself. There is a software supply chain in every industry. It's analyzing the performance and security of those components based on the development, and how easy that has become. And you look at manufacturing supply chains, and that really has just been mirrored into the software supply chain for open source components. There's some great components out there that are innovative. They come from some brilliant people and some brilliant minds, and they really are cutting edge. And they are very big. Some of them are very scalable, and they're developed at a super fast pace. So really, we need to understand how that's come about over time. So faster is better for the enterprise. So we look at enterprise organizations and what they've done historically. So this is Nicole Forsman. She's been studying performance software development in organizations for many years. We sort of did some work with her last year for our State of DevOps report. And really, what she sort of came to the conclusion was faster is better. So if we look at the elite performers of software development, and how that sort of has evolved over time. So they are developing, or rather frequently deploying code 208 times faster than most other organizations, which means more commits, faster recovery time from incidents, and also a lower change failure rate. So the faster they can develop software using the right supply chain gives you just increased benefits tenfold. And we look at how a current enterprise organization has taken that and driven it. I mean, we all know Jeff Bezos. He's the wealthiest man in the world, give or take 20-30 billion. So what he's sort of looked at from an organization like Amazon is the sheer amount of resources they have. They can implement with ease a lot of different processes, a lot of different policies. They've got the tools, the machines, and the infrastructure in place to do that. But one thing they say is a good process serves you so you can serve your customers, which is exactly what we all do in development and especially in financial services. But we need to make sure the process doesn't become the thing that drives you. what needs to drive you is obviously the outcome. What is it you're trying to deliver? And the process should facilitate that to give you the outcome, rather than the process being the thing that drives where you're going. So obviously, what drives that is competition, adversaries. There'd be no need for security if we all had no adversaries. It's that goes without saying. That drives the speed. Faster is better. So the more competition you've got, the faster things can be developed, and the faster you want to be ahead of that curve. So let's quickly look at this, the famous Struts 2. So if we look at the speed of this and how it was exploited, really, to show you the speed of how you should develop against it. So in March 7, 2017, I think it was, Struts 2 announced its vulnerability. By the 9th, we've seen a huge increase in exploitable events that led up to that. And literally by March the 10th, we've seen 4 big hacks, which was Equifax, the Canadian Revenue Agency, Canadian Statistics Bureau, and a payment company in Japan. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. That then sort of rolled on to modern today. And there's a couple of names there listed on the slide deck. But today, there's over 65% of Fortune 100 companies downloaded the vulnerable component, the vulnerable version of Struts 2. So they're still downloading that same version that Equifax got exploited with. It just goes to show the speed of development is there, but the speed of adoption isn't really where it should be. So let's just take a quick look to this year. So between March and May 2020, most of us were in lockdown during that period, which meant a lot of people were sitting at home. A lot of things were going on. I'm not going to read this slide. Obviously, it's a very big slide. But if we look at from March to May, there was a lot of vulnerabilities from a lot of different ecosystems across time. And what they basically did was it just exponentially increased over that 3-month period. I mean, specifically look at May the 2nd. There's 18 breaches just on GitHub accounts from May the 2nd. And that carried on, obviously, it still carries on today. And there's no let up from this. There's no sort of decrease in what we're seeing. What we're seeing is an extended timeline. So from the Equifax one specifically, I sort of extrapolated the timeline for Equifax and how that sort of looks over time. So from February the 14th, when or rather beginning of March, end of February, when the Apache identified the Struts vulnerability, March the 7th is when it was made available. So everybody sort of knew that it was vulnerable and there was a fix available. 3 days later, Equifax were breached. Number of the date lines across there, from July 29th, they detected it. So it was sort of a couple of months on. They patched it literally immediately. But by that point, the damage was already done. There was already 2 or 3 months of data and breach that was happening and occurring within Equifax. What makes it even worse is the amount of announcements that came after that. So the amount of data that was lost. So if we look at the sort of the statistics around that, it was 76 days by the time the attackers were 76 days the attackers were active within Equifax's environment. There was 160 million users' data was compromised. And the current bill, or the current sort of financial impact to Equifax, we believe is 1.4 billion. And that's not just in fines, it's in compensation payments and a number of other things. So the speed of adopting these software and obviously remediating the issues that are with this sort of supply chain is key. As the CTO of Equifax now says, if you're not moving at the pace of an organization that's coming off a breach, then you're not moving fast enough. So speed is key. So let's look at the stats behind this. So we looked at organizations and asked, have they had an OSS breach? If we look at the stats over the past 4 years, 2017 was a no, 2018, obviously that number increased, and thankfully it's gone down over time. Is this more because GDPR related sort of governance is coming into place, more regulations are in place? I know with the financial services industry, there's a lot of regulations around what can and cannot be done. But this is it's the engineering teams are getting faster in their ability to respond to zero-day vulnerabilities because of the information they have to hand. So time to remediation. So if we look at how long it takes to remediate a vulnerability after it has been detected, 2% of companies say less than an hour, 12% less than a day. But if we look at 51% of these, it's between 1 week and never. So within a week of a vulnerability being detected, it takes at least a week to a year in 51% of organizations to remediate that vulnerability. If we use Equifax as an example, it was 3 days from the vulnerability being detected to when they were exploited. So they're moving a lot faster than obviously most organizations. There's not as much policy and process in the bad side of it as there is the good side of it. So we seek the most efficient path. To be competitive, you want the efficient path, you want the quickest way to remediation, you want the quickest way to get the data you want. So that's now evolving to a next generation of software supply chain attacks. So if we look at sort of what's new in sort of a typical vulnerabilities, we look at typo squatting, malicious code injection, tool tampering. They're the new things we're seeing to date. And if we look at sort of the historical data around those, there's 216 attacks from February 2015 to June 2019. That changed from July 2019 to currently today, with a 430% increase in attacks of these modern day, sort of vulnerability vectors. Now, what are they? So these are the sort of things we're seeing. In March 2008, we've seen NPN credentials intentionally compromised, stealing passwords, stealing money through cryptocurrency, backdoor and tool tampering is sort of two of the new ones that are coming out, which is sort of typo squatting, injecting malicious code into components as they're being deployed into the ecosystems. Obviously, these slides will be available to you after today, but they are getting very inventive around the ways they produce vulnerabilities and the attack vectors in organizations. So faster is better for open source. Obviously, there's a larger audience, there's a larger amount of people out there who are part of these communities who drive this software. And that's for you to embrace and utilize and adopt into your tool sets to really help you drive your product lines to be able to release faster and actually deploy within the environments you need to. On an annual basis, Sonatype, we release a state of software supply chain report, which you can download from our website. This really looks at how organizations are building software, the tooling in place, the processes they have in place, and really helps them understand, or really we provide a report to help everyone understand how that supply chain is really made up and the issues around that. So we have an interview process for the projects. We look at all the projects in general, different attributes like obviously the popularity, the size of the development teams, how often they commit builds, how often they release versions of that software, what's the support around it, the security around the components. Obviously, that's very complicated in if it's secure or not. It depends if something's been exploited or not, or if it's been detected. And again, how fast are those vulnerabilities that are detected? How fast are they remediated? So really, that gives us a good insight as to the state of projects as a whole. So when we offer guidance around open source projects, we look at how fast they accelerate and maintain their MTTU, so time to update, how often they do project commits, when there are dependencies, do they look at the transitive dependencies, do they look at what they're including, and do they really need to include the dependencies they are including, or are they just taking projects as a whole and putting them into their project? And do they aim for a sort of a consistent release pattern? So not just releasing every week, for example, they're doing a sort of a pattern of releasing software that sort of fits with people's deployment processes, and do they upgrade their dependencies. Dependency management is key with open source projects, because as we all know, components are pulled in from all sorts of places, and obviously driven to make their projects better. You need to really manage what's being included in the platform you're delivering. From an enterprise perspective, you sort of flip that on its head slightly. So that's what we just discussed, was open source projects. Now, how do you adopt those into your organizations? You need to choose those projects which have a strategic a decision process in how that project's evolving. What's the implementation criteria? How important is the time to update? Formalizing the procurement process. There is a procurement process with open source packages, whether it be, it's not necessarily a financial one, but there is a process of validating if there's a license requirement, if there's security vulnerabilities. What do you need to do to adopt that piece of code into yours? And then obviously minimize the variability of that software. How often will that change? How many suppliers are you going to have in your infrastructure? Obviously, it's a supply chain, so there is a number of different components you would have to manage and process to include as you do your development. But if we look at sort of Java as an example, so Java components are downloaded. Well, obviously we manage Maven Central. We are the custodians of Maven Central. So we look at the downloads and obviously what goes on through Maven Central. But we look at the Java component is downloaded on average 373,000 times annually. That's over 3,500 different suppliers. And through those components, there's over 30,000 known vulnerabilities. Doesn't mean you're using one of the vulnerable ones, but you need to understand what you're using and which ones of the ones you're using are vulnerable. That way you can get a good understanding and a good management of those components. So, faster and more secure, achievable in the enterprise? Yes, it is. Are faster and more secure achievable in the enterprise? No, it's not. We need to look at the overall picture. We'd like to think it is, but enterprise development manage dependencies. So we look at, do they manage dependencies in the way they should? Do they schedule updates? Do they strive for the latest version? Do they use the same processes or the process to manage that dependency? Do they proactively remove dependencies they don't use? And have they automated tools to back up that process and really manage what dependencies are being pulled in and the status of those dependencies? So overall, they do manage some of this. These are the sort of key enterprise ones. And if you manage all of these processes, it makes life a lot easier. But it's really understanding what components you have and the process you have in place. So during our survey, we surveyed over 679 different enterprise organizations, asking questions like the remediation times, component tracking, the breaches and productivity around those. And really, we found 4 distinct outcomes. So if we look at the sort of top right, the high performers, they are security and development are efficient and productive leaders. So they are very efficient in what they do, both from a security and development perspective. On the top left, security is key. So security knows exactly what they're doing, but development is slowed down either by policy or process or by uneducation, a number of different areas really. And then sort of the bottom of the quadrant, we've got low performers, which basically is they put security first, and really they need to be transformed into really looking at how they can perform better development with more security focus, and obviously productivity first, the bottom right, which is basically develop a product and security falls to the wayside. So there's all the quadrants which have come into place, the different organizations and how they sit. So if we look at how those different areas compare against each other, the differences between those 4 groups. So if we compare high performers against low performers, high performers are 15%, they deploy 15 times more frequently than low performers. The detection rate of vulnerabilities is 26 times faster, and so is the remediation. I won't read all the stats on the page, but basically the time to resolve issues and actually implement issues that have come out are basically 20 to 30 times faster than most other organizations. And if we look at if we look at high performers against security first performers, 59% more likely to be using software composition analysis tools like Sonatype. They have more likely to have a process in place to automate the implementation and so the development of these components from an approval and management perspective, from the adoption perspective. They can enforce governance, so they have policies in place to enforce during the CI process. So do they fail builds? Do they provide information to the developer at the desktop? Do they have a software bill of materials? Do they really understand what goes into their software and actually how that software is compiled? So if somebody does ask the question, do we have this vulnerability? Has this version of struts got into our software? They know very quickly it exists. And then 96% are more likely to centrally scan and deploy artifacts. So they have a central base where they know where everything is, what it sort of all comes to, and really the security and license compliance of those. And that's what spins back to a question we had in the Nordea session earlier was, how do companies manage and mitigate open source risks? This sort of says it all, in my opinion. It's about having a tool or a process and a policy in place which helps you understand what it is you're adopting into your environment, what those software components are. The outcome of those to a degree is secondary. Once you understand what's there, you can then make decisions based on that information. So really, sort of a guide towards enterprise deployment is prioritize your software supply chain from an open source software management perspective. Identify the gaps in your software and the process and the constraints. So where are the gaps that you need to fulfill? What constraints do your teams have to work under? Aim for quick wins. If you can pick a component that has 0 vulnerabilities towards a component that has 10, that just saves you a lot of work in the process. It saves your security team having to do work to look at what those vulnerabilities are. It saves sort of people having to go through a process, research, any remediation that may need to take place. Pursue speed and security improvements of those components, and really understand how quickly you can invoke those improvements in that code base. If you do all of those things, you get happier employees, less work to do, obviously better quality software, and less comeback from the powers that be sort of higher up the management chain, to be honest. But all that's great. What makes it slightly more complicated for particularly the financial industry is the regulation and software liability sort of curve. I mean, there's a timeline there for the past sort of 6 years, and the amount of regulations and sort of processes that have come in place that companies have to adhere to now have grown exponentially. Specifically, I mean, let's use PCI as an example for the financial services. So PCI, as most of you know, is for credit card payment information. PCI compliance, it started a few years ago, many years ago actually, and I think it was last year they're actually putting more policies and more processes in place specifically relating to open source. So one off the top of my head that I know of is it was a case of any software component that has a vulnerability that is severe, so basically CVSS 9 or higher, you have 30 days to fix from time of announcement. So that's quite difficult if you don't understand your bill of materials, if you don't understand the components you have. How do you even know this component exists? How do you know the vulnerability exists? How do you know you've got 30 days to fulfill that requirement? So it really boils down to building a bill of materials and understanding what that is, and then managing that supply chain as it goes forward. So I know this discussion is going on sort of a bit further on later on. We have Nick Coombs from Sonatype who's hosting a roundtable at 1:50, I believe. Is that right, Matthew? I think it's
yes, that's correct, Phyto. There'll be the roundtables with the sponsors will be running concurrently at 1:50, and all you have to do as a delegate is go back to your timeline, join the session that you wish, and you'll be let in and join. Start the discussion. Please bring your own experiences and opinions to these roundtables.
Fantastic, thank you. So that's really it from me. I know we should have 5 minutes left or so, Matthew, for any questions. I left a little bit extra time, as I'm sure there'll be some questions. I see them coming up from previous sessions.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a couple of questions. I wanted to start by with one myself, actually, going back to that very interesting scatter chart that you showed with the different priorities, if you like, for managing security. My question was, Phyto, how many financial firms tend to have a policy or an enterprise strategy that embraces such a view of these priorities? And how does the financial services sector compare, for example, with other sectors, other verticals, healthcare, retail?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. So financial services definitely are ahead of the curve, for sure. There's security has always been key, or rather, I wouldn't say security. I'd say risk has always been key within financial organizations. So financial services see risk very differently to most other companies or most other verticals. So they're looking at it from not necessarily financial or a breach, not necessarily from a breach or financial, but more of a brand, from my experience. Obviously, there's money in finance. Everyone knows that, and no one wants to lose money. But it's about brand reputation. So security is always key to try and protect that brand itself. Licensing, as we know, open source started sort of many years ago from more driven from a license perspective, and that's not key here. So it's more about how do you deliver software in a faster time that actually protects the integrity of your brand. And that is sort of different to most organizations. A lot of companies, it's everyone protects their brand, but for most companies that deliver in sort of data as such, it's about protecting the IP of the organization, protecting sort of the contents and what they've got. Whereas financially, it's about, obviously it's people's money, it's people's livelihoods. Equifax story shows true what it is. It's a lot of valuable data that can go missing. So it's protecting the information you've got and the brand that's recognized to protect it.
Okay, very good. The other question that's come up, again, I have to sort of interpret it slightly, but it's a question from one of our delegates about managing the choices for managing open source tooling using external partners. What do you see as the major decisions that have to be made? I mean, so I guess this is really about, if you want your hand held through this process of managing your strategy for the adoption of open source, how do you choose a partner?
Oh, we talk to us first. No, it's a tough one because every organization has a different policy or different outputs. So it's really understanding what it is you're trying to gain and what policies or what's your overall goal. Once you sort of understand that, it's a case of looking at the policy workshops that can be delivered, understanding how those policies influence your processes. And then really looking at the infrastructure you've got in place as well. We know Atlassian is quite big out there. There's a lot of different, we've got partners as well which help us sort of do that. But how to choose, it really depends on the outcomes you want to drive to. Is it a hosted solution? Is it an in-house solution? Do you have offline networks? There's different factors to take into account. Obviously, speaking to the vendors directly, sort of give you an input into what the tooling can do. And then obviously, given those conversations, we do have partners we tie up with where we say, actually, we think this partner would be a good fit for you because of this is what they deliver specifically to the financial services. They know different tool sets and they can deliver what they want. So I think the vendors really know the partners that can facilitate their needs best, which I think is key, because obviously picking partners is very difficult in that respect.
Okay, I think we have to end it there. We're running out of time. Just to mention again that you will be in the breakout sessions later at 12. What time are the breakout sessions? Those are happening at 12:50, I believe. Sorry, 13:50, 12:50 BST, 13:50 CET. and Sonatype will be there. Nick Coombs, I think, is chairing that roundtable, but I think you'll be there as well, won't
Yes, I
you?
will.
Yes, so do log in there. Now, to get the updated timeline, go back to your timeline. I would like to mention that there was a technical glitch with the Exact Pro presentation earlier today. There was a password requirement which we didn't want on there. It did stop a number of delegates joining that session. We're actually going to be running that again, a recording of that session after the roundtables at 2:10 p.m., 14:10 p.m. CET, 1:10 p.m. UK time. Okay, Phyto, thank you very much. We're going to leave it there, and I'm going to be handing actually to my colleague Justin Trenner for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.